Yeah.
I just
So we've
wanted
got a lot of folks today, huh? This is awesome.
Yeah.
I just wanted to remind everybody that I'm going to be recording this just in case someone can't come. So just know that you're clean up your act. No.
This is great.
And can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Can
got
you
a
give
couple
thumbs up
up.
or something?
Yep.
You can hear?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, everyone's trickling in. That's good. I know Dr. Reeves is a very interactive presenter, so he might like to see your face.
Yes, I would like to see everybody's faces. If you can see this handsome face, I have to see everybody else. I have to see everybody else's faces. Now, when you disagree with what I say, then you can totally turn the camera off. I won't be offended. But you've got a great crowd today, so this is awesome.
Yeah, there are 31 of us here so far, so
Wow,
that's good.
awesome. And then both of you, just remind me, how much time do I have? When does the class end?
It ends about 4:30. Should we wrap it up, guys?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, terrific. So I'm going to probably try to just, I have a PowerPoint that I will present specifically for you guys. And I'll try to go through it in about 20-25 minutes. But it's just really meant to stimulate conversations, and I hope that there'll be tons of questions. And we can use the chat function. And if one of you will just keep an eye on that so I don't miss any question that comes to me. And then I'll give my contact information at the end. So if people want to follow up with me, I want to invite them to sort of do that as well.
That's great.
Okay. Should we get started?
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to introduce you briefly to all the people here. Dr. Keith Reeves is the faculty director of the program on urban inequality and incarceration in the Lang Center for Civic and Social Responsibility at Swarthmore. And you know, if it's a center called Civic and Social Responsibility, it's up our alley. So, he's also a professor of political science and just finished up his term as department chair in that political science department. And he's on sabbatical for a year, so jealous we are. Before joining Swarthmore, Dr. Reeves taught public policy at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. So, you know, he has a deep background. He's studied overseas and worked overseas and been a scholar overseas. But it's very appropriate that Dr. Reeves is visiting us on National Voter Registration Day. Did you guys know it's National Voter Registration Day? Because he's written a book about racial politics in America, and he's really into voting rights too, which is something close to my heart. Mm-hmm. But he's here today to help us understand the high incarceration rates of young Black males. He's very involved in prison programs locally, and I'm sure that he has a lot of insights to share with us. I've heard him present before, and he's dynamic and awesome. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Reeves. And
terrific.
I would suggest all of you, if you'd like to keep your view in speaker view, because he's going to be sharing.
Yes, I would love to see your faces. And so thank you, Professor Youngman, for the introduction. I'll try to live up to the hype. And it's wonderful to be with you guys. What I want to take you through is I've got a PowerPoint that I prepared for you specifically. It's about 20-25 minutes, and I'll ask to see as many of your faces as we can. And the PowerPoint is really meant to provoke questions and comments, and I hope some disagreement. And we'll have ample time to take your questions and to put discussion questions and items in the chat function. So I'll ask both of your profs if they will keep an eye on that. I want to make sure I don't miss a question. And then at the end, I'll give you my contact information so that if you want to follow up with me, I want to encourage you to do that. before I get started, I would love for everybody to go through and just give me your name and where you're from. I want to have a sense of where you're coming from in geography, and then I'll share my screen with you, and then I'll walk you through some initial comments and observations that hopefully will get you fired up and get you ready to argue with me. Okay? So, Nicholas, if you'll start, and then we'll just go Hollywood Square style.
Which one?
Conroy.
Oh, but there's more than one Nicholas. Okay, all right. All right. Nicholas C.
Okay, I'm Nick, obviously. I'm from Abington, Pennsylvania.
Okay, awesome.
Tyler? S. Tyler S.
My name's Tyler, and I'm from Upper Dublin, PA.
Nice.
Kiera?
My name is Kira. I'm from Philadelphia.
Okay, terrific.
Do you want to take it, Keith? I don't want to keep interrupting you.
No. Just you know everybody, so I just want to put name with face and where they're from. So totally, Kathy, you're doing a great job.
Okay, I'm just going in my Hollywood Square,
Okay,
which is different.
Terrific. Which is different from mine, right?
Tom T.
My name is Tom Shuxes. I'm from Ridley Township, Delaware County.
Okay, not too far from me. Good. We're probably about 10 minutes away from each other. Literally.
James.
I'm James Pettis, and I'm from Lincoln University, PA.
Okay, terrific.
David Hare.
Hi, how are you? My name's Dave. I'm from South Jersey.
Okay, terrific. Nice to see you, Dave.
Nice to see you too.
Amy.
Hi, my name's Amy, and I'm also from South Jersey.
Okay, terrific.
Nick.
Hi, I'm Nick. I'm from Marple in Delaware County.
Okay, terrific. We're not too far from each other. Nice to see you.
Evan.
Hi, my name's Evan, and I'm from Media, PA.
Okay, right up the street. Nice.
Yeah.
Morgan. Mo.
So I'm Mo, and I'm from Stone Harbor, New Jersey.
Terrific. Nice to see you, Morgan.
I see the picture of the beach behind you, Mo.
so jealous. So jealous.
Melissa.
Hi, I'm Melissa, and I'm also from Marple, PA.
Nice to see you, Melissa.
America.
Hi, I'm American. I'm from Lewis, Delaware.
Okay, nice to see you. I know where you are.
Chris G.
I'm Chris Jacoby. I'm from South Jersey as well.
Okay.
Matthews is not my last name.
Terrific. Nice to see you.
See you too.
And he tells me that another professor changed his name on his Zoom ID.
Usame. I just outed him.
Jason.
Hi, I'm Jason. I'm from North Jersey.
Okay. Hi, Jason.
And Brian.
My name is Brian Janelle. I'm from Southwest Philly.
Nice. Hi, Brian.
Alex.
Hi, I'm Alexandra, and I'm from North Philly.
Okay. Hi, Alexandra. Nice to see you.
John Fennell.
Hey, I'm John. I'm from King of Prussia.
Hey, John.
Miranda.
Hi, I'm Miranda. I'm from Northeast Philly.
Nice to see you, Miranda.
Karina.
Hi, I'm Karina, and I'm also from Northeast Philly.
Okay. Hi, Karina.
Hi.
You've got a nice North Philly crowd here, huh? Okay. Have to be on my toes.
Joey.
Hi, I'm Joey. I'm from Plymouth Meeting.
Okay, terrific. Hi, Joey.
Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt, and I'm from Norristown, PA.
Okay. Hi, Matt. Nice to see you.
Sierra.
Hi, I'm Sierra. I'm from Newark, Delaware.
Okay. Hi, Sierra.
Rodrigo.
Hi, I'm Rodrigo, and I'm from Valley Forge, Pennsylvania.
Terrific. Hi, Rodrigo. Nice to see you.
Katie.
I'm Katie. I'm from Northeast Philly.
Okay. Hi, Katie.
Tyler O'Connor.
Hi, I'm Tyler. I'm from Central Jersey.
Okay. Nice to see you, Tyler. Awesome.
Griffin.
Hi, I'm Griffin, and I'm from Northern Arizona.
Terrific. Awesome. Arizona, all the way from. Awesome. Awesome. Nice to see you.
Melanie.
Hi, I'm Melanie, and I'm from Prospect Park, Pennsylvania.
Okay. Terrific. Not too far. Hi, Melanie.
Hi.
Maya.
Hi, I'm Maya, and I'm from Norristown, Pennsylvania.
Okay. Hi, Maya. Nice to see your face. Thank you.
Yeah, leave your camera on, guys. Did I miss anybody?
We get everybody?
Oops, Ashlyn's waiting in the waiting room. Oop, one of the project managers of the group.
Okay, terrific.
I'm sorry, I didn't notice her.
Great. Well, nice to see everybody. Thank you for introducing yourselves. As your prof said, I am Keith Reeves. I want to give you a little bit of background in terms of who I am and why I do this work, and to dispense any kind of notion that somehow I planned the teaching career that I turned out to have. So let me share my screen if I could for a moment. Let's see. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I want to talk a little bit about, as Kathy has given me the assignment to take you through sort of understanding the mass incarceration crisis among Black males. Most of you are familiar with the killing of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police officer. And essentially what's been happening, as many of you will know over the last couple of months or so, has really been a kind of a racial reckoning in the country. And some of it has to do, its roots, its origins has to do with perceived and or actual mistreatment on the part of police. But also, as some of you who've been paying really close attention will also notice and pick up, that a lot of it has to also grapple and deal with the notion around mass incarceration and the criminal justice system. And so what I want to take you through is some of my work, my experiences working with this particular population, and perhaps give you some, correct some misperceptions of what this group is, who they are, why they're sent to prison, and importantly, I'm going to make an argument to you that if we're going to get our way out of this crisis, this racial reckoning at some point, we really will have to deal with the criminal legal system. I won't say criminal justice system for some reasons that will be pretty obvious shortly. So I want to take you through this, and then I want to just give you a sense of what I'm going to sort of walk you through so you can hold me to account to see that I've covered some of this. So I want to talk a little bit about the nature of the problem, a bit of background, some context. When you are talking about crime and criminal legal processes, those of you, all of you are mass communication scholars, so you know this. It's really, really important to talk about context. So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about context, what that means, and the disparities that come to fore, particularly when we are looking at issues of race and crime and criminal legal processes and so forth. And then I'm going to make an argument to you that essentially what's been happening in this country, particularly since the early 1970s, has been a mass incarceration crisis among poor people, poor places, and I'm going to map out some of its consequences. And so I will make an argument. I hope some of you will disagree with me and we'll have a back and forth. And as I said, I'll give you my contact information at the end so that we have a chance to follow up and continue to argue over email and so forth. I love being with students in particular, so I'm a little disappointed that I can't be with you in person, but happy that we can do this virtually. But we can still argue over, over email and over the screen. Then importantly, I want to give you a bit of data. And then I want to suggest some policy recommendations. Some of you might be familiar with some of what I'm going to present, but I want to sort of map out some things that need to be in the conversation. And then I'm going to spend a lot of time in the Q&A And so I want to encourage you to put questions and comments in the chat function as well. Let me, before I take up this particular graph, let me just say a little bit about my background. I mentioned that I didn't start this work intentionally. And so when I was at the Kennedy School at Harvard as a faculty member, I'd gotten the invitation to come back to Swarthmore. I grew up in Chester, which is, some of you will know, it's a pretty now impoverished place. It did not always have that, that moniker. But when I was growing up in Chester, it was a very vibrant, thriving, urban blue-collar community. And so when I came back to the area and joined the faculty at Swarthmore back in 1999, I had a childhood friend who said to me, Keith, you need to go down to the prison. And I said, what are you talking about? There's no prison in Chester. And she said, yeah, there's a prison. And I just ignored her for 2 years. I brushed her off. And her husband, who had been doing a lot of community activism work, came to me and said, Doc, you need to go to the prison. And I kept blowing him off because I had no experience dealing with prison populations. I had never been in a prison. I didn't have family members who were incarcerated, anything of that sort. I did have an aunt who's deceased now, who was a corrections officer in New York for 30 plus years, but she kept her work very separate from her family life and all. So we knew that she was a security guard when I was growing up, but I didn't know she was actually a corrections officer. So I had no experience dealing with prisons at all. And I got the invitation to come down to the state correctional prison in Chester, which I'll show you a graph of shortly. And I met a neighbor, a former neighbor who was there, an older gentleman who asked permission to speak to me. And the superintendent said yes. And he said to me, you look familiar. And I said, with all due respect, I don't think so. And he says, no, I think, where did you grow up? And I said, I grew up in Chester with my twin brother. And he says, I remember you guys were Boy Scouts, were you? And I said, yes. And I ended up having a conversation with him. At that point, this was February 3rd, 2003. And so I remember it like it was my birthday because it changed my professional and it changed my personal life. And so we get into a conversation. And at that point, February 3rd, 2003, he had been in prison for 27 years. He was serving a life sentence. 4 kids, all adults. 3 of the kids were in and out of prison. Only one daughter who was a nurse did well. And you could have knocked me over with a feather. I had no idea. Quite honestly, I vaguely remembered him. But remember, I said I had no experience dealing with anybody who had been incarcerated. And so we subsequently start a pen pal exchange. We start writing each other back and forth. And he asked if I would come down to visit him. And so I spent very quietly about 7 years just going in every week and mentoring him and a few others. And just getting to know who they are. I wanted to know why they were in prison. I wanted to know also how this community that I had grown up in, that my twin and I had grown up in, why was it sending so many of its young men off to prison and all? So for me, it was an intellectual policy puzzle, but it also quickly became very personal because I got to know the men very well. And subsequently, I got invited to start teaching there, and I started, Professor Youngman said to me that you guys have a Inside Out program. I started the Inside Out program at Swarthmore, which is a program where they bring in, as you well know, college students who go into prison spaces. I believe you guys go up to Greaterford. And you have a series of classes with incarcerated men and or women. We work primarily with the men, and you get a chance to learn from each other. So I started Swarthmore's program, but it came really because I had been doing all of this mentoring, teaching work at Chester, and I'd done some work at the county prison, which I'll say something about as well. As I mentioned, it changed my personal life. And when John Lewis, the former congressman, says that we need to get into trouble, we need to get into good trouble, for me, this is my getting into trouble. And as I will share with you, particularly in the Q&A, many of the men I work with are incredibly bright. They're much brighter, quite frankly, than I am. And so part of my mission, part of my policy job is to try to figure out why they're going off to prison, to try to do what I can to help when they get there, that is the teaching and mentoring, but also to step back and think about some policy, structural kinds of things that we need to think through if we're going to stave off an entire generation or two from ending in this space. And I'll say at the very end, if we don't do something about this problem, we all will pay for it. We're paying for it now in some interesting ways, but we all will pay for this. So one of the things I wanted to just show you, if you look at this graph here, you'll see the text says that this is a figure that shows a rising, falling crime rate trend and an increasing incarceration rate of sentenced prisoners in federal and state prisons institutions from 1931 to 2004. So one of the things I want you to see is that if you look at that first marker in 1931, the prison population, that's that first dotted line, that prison population was relatively stable from 1931 until about 1973. And whether you're liberal or conservative, whether you're a liberal criminologist or conservative criminologist, or a liberal policymaker or conservative policymaker, there is a consensus that somewhere around 1970, 73 is when we start seeing a prison population starting to increase. Also happen to be increasing crime rates as well. And so part of what you see there is you see an increasing incarceration rate. You also see an increasing crime rate, but you also see a point in the later 1990s where you see the prison rate continue to climb, and yet you see the crime rate starting to fall. And I want to understand that cross set of pressures there. And I'm going to say something shortly about crime and the nature of crime and how and who determines who is a criminal or not. And as mass communication scholars, you will have a lot to say about that, and you have a lot to determine who is labeled a criminal and how that seeps into the popular and public political culture that then puts into place a whole cascading set of consequences and so forth. So I just want to give you this kind of data point as important contextual backdrop. And then I want to give you a sense of the area that I study. So you see Delaware County. Most of you are from Delaware County, not all of you. Some of you may or may not know, Delaware County has, that Pennsylvania has 67 counties, I believe. Every county has its own jail. And you know that jail is different than a prison. Jail is an institution that has you either pre-trial, or you can't make bail, or you have a sentence of 2 years or less. Prison is the state institution that has you doing a sentence of 2 years or more, sometimes a life sentence. So a lot of the men I've worked with at Chester, the Chester prison, which is a state facility, are there at Chester because they have a prison sentence of 2 years or more. Many of them actually are serving a life sentence. And so I've dealt with folks and men at the Chester prison, which is a state facility, but I've also mentored men who've been at the county prison. And the county prison is interesting because it is the only privatized jail in the state of Pennsylvania, which is remarkable. Those of you who are residents of Delaware County, we pay on average, I believe, something on the order of about $50 to $55 million a year for the county prison. And enormous costs to taxpayers. And the GO group, which is the group that manages it, makes a profit apparently of around $3 million a year. And so there's an interesting conversation in the literature and among policy folks and criminal justice activists. Why are private prison companies making money off of misery and poverty and criminal behavior and so forth? So I just want to draw a distinction between the jail and prison context. And then for those of you from Philadelphia, Philadelphia has its own prison system, jail system, which is separate from the county. And we've dealt with lots of men who've come from Philadelphia, from Chester, from Darby, Upper Darby, from the rural parts of Pennsylvania as well. And the wonderful thing about teaching in a place like Chester is I have men, and I'll show you that next slide. This is the State Correctional Facility at Chester. I have men that I work with who are Black, poor, white, Latino, who are wealthy, who are well off, many of whom at Chester have at their core an alcohol or substance abuse addiction that then has helped or led them to committing a crime for which they have been charged and or convicted and sentenced. And so we end up working with them in this space. Since 2003, I probably have made more than 400 visits to this facility and to other state correction facilities across the state. How many of you, just show of hands, are Law and Order fans? How many of Law and Order fans? There are a number of Law and Order fans there. You know, Detective Benson is always going to visit some person at Sing Sing prison. I've made visits to Sing Sing and to Graterford. So I have a lot of experience coming into these spaces. And as I was saying to Professor Youngman before we started, this is the most rewarding, don't say this to my Swarthmore students, but this is the most rewarding teaching I've done, but it's the hardest I've ever done because you're having to connect with men and their families and their children, while at the same time you're trying to get them excited about higher ed and trying to undo what a high school teacher or someone else has told them that they couldn't do. And those of you who have taken the Cabrini Inside Out courses will know exactly what I'm talking about. So let me just give you a little bit of additional research methodology pieces so that when I say something or when I make a comment, some of it will be based on data, some of it will be based on some of my anecdotal experiences. And so I come at this work with an enormous, we call it methodological pluralism, an enormous methodological 360 angle, if you will. And my research assistants and I have been working on various projects over the years, and we are going through archival records, newspapers, historical documents, primary documents as well. We have an enormous amount of ethnographic and interview data. Specifically, I work in Chester and Philadelphia primarily. And importantly, and I'm going to show you this data shortly, we have, I've been given wonderful access to administrative data from the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. And I'm going to show you data that they were kind enough to share with me from 1990 to 2005 that includes about 46,000 prison records. These are individuals who have been sentenced to the state system, remember, serving 2 years or more, who are coming from Chester and or Philadelphia. And then I do a lot of participant observation. So I'm mentoring, I'm teaching, I'm in prison jails all the time. I sit on a number of policy groups and conversations, both regionally, locally, and nationally. And then we're also priming a lot of census data. Because remember, I said to you, I want to say something about context. When someone commits a crime, and we're going to have a conversation about this shortly, when somebody commits a crime, it is not devoid of context and or circumstances. And part of what I want to make an argument for is that context has to start coming back into our conversations when we think about police, when we think about policing, when we think about police surveillance, when we think about who gets arrested, who gets charged, who gets convicted, and ultimately who ends up doing time either in a jail or prison. And importantly, the process that we call reentry, and that is when someone serves his or her time, they come back into the community space, they're coming back to North Philadelphia, they're coming back to Chester, they're coming back to Reading, they're coming back to Lancaster, and that person now has to put his or her life back together. They have to find a job, they have to get alcohol, substance abuse counseling, they have to take care of family, they have to take care of kids, and that ends up being the equivalent of a series of landmines, if you will. And one of the things that we know is that individuals, if they don't have a job and or housing, within the first 3 years, they will go back, oftentimes, unfortunately, back to prison or jail because they would have been tripped up. And so there's an interesting question of, have they been set up to fail before they've even had a chance to try to get their legs underneath them? So we're going to say something a lot about context, and I'll show you some information on that. And then very importantly, and you can only share this with this group, I'm going to show you some GIS mapping of some of those records, those prison records, to show you the importance of context. And I'm going to beat up my Swarthmore neighbors, draw a distinction between the wealthier parts of Swarthmore and, again, who goes off to prison, who gets arrested, who gets sentenced or not, and the ways in which racial wealth, class disparities play a part and a role in terms of who goes off to prison. So that's my tall order, and you're going to hold me account to whether I do all this or not. Let me just share with you very quickly a bit of what we call American exceptionalism. You guys know that we oftentimes like to say, we're number one, we're number one. We go around the world saying we're number one. And we're number one, yes, but we're number one on some other important problematic metrics. And one of them is the first one here, and that is the US has 5% of the world's population, but we hold 25% of all the world's prisoners. And I want you guys to settle in on that just for a moment. The US has 5% of the world's population. Reminds you, right? We are a country of 330 million people, right? We have 5% of the world's population, but yet we hold 25% of the world's prisoners. The rest of the world is saying to us, what the hell are you guys doing? And that is problematic, particularly for those of you who go into the diplomatic corps and or who go into the military. You're going to have to explain this. You will invariably get asked, so why are you sending all those immigrants and those black and brown people to prison? Explain that to us. Secondly, nationally, there are on any given day 2.2 million fellow American citizens who are in jail or prison. African Americans constitute 12% of the US population, but comprise about 35% of the prison population in the US. So 12% of the total population, and yet 35% of the prison population. And it is higher in some communities like Chester, Philadelphia, Baltimore, DC, Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago. We have to reckon with that. And so by the end of 2015, Black males specifically constitute 34% of the American prison population. I will update this in the next couple of weeks. So that's the other piece. Why is it that so many Black men, Latino men also, end up doing time in jail or prison? We know that the number of Black men in jail or prison, on probation or on parole by the end of 2009, roughly equaled the same number of individuals who were enslaved in 1850. So let me repeat that. The number of Black men in jail or prison, on probation or parole, by the end of 2009, roughly equaled the number of enslaved individuals in 1850. And that stat comes specifically from Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which I know some of you have read and or familiar with. So that's the national story. And everybody should be getting a little unsettled here, right? Let's drive down a little bit more closer to home. In Pennsylvania, there are nearly 50,000 individuals under the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. That is starting to decrease and has been decreasing. It's probably now, I think when this slide was done, it was about 50,000. It's probably down, I have to check the latest stats, probably down to about 43,000 individuals still doing time at the state level. And they are connected to about 81,000 children. 1 in 5 Philadelphians have a criminal record. That is, if you could be passing anybody in Center City, anybody down in Penn's Landing, and invariably 1 in 5 Philadelphians has a criminal record. And there are approximately, we believe, 45,000 African-American children who have a parent who's either in jail or recently been released. And we'll talk a little bit about some of what we call the collateral consequences for someone who's in prison. If I am in prison or jail, it means that not simply am I in jail and prison, it means that my entire family is actually in jail or prison with me. And in some instances, the larger extended family, and in some instances, the community, the neighborhood is in jail and prison with me. And I'll say something a little bit more about that. Everybody with me so far?
Yep.
And then let me share a little bit more of these last stats. and then I'm going to show you some data. So we know from the research literature that 1 in 3 Black men who were born in 2001 can expect to be incarcerated at some time in his lifetime. Then that is a really, of all the stats I'm going to present to you, for me, that's the most arresting, no pun intended, the most disturbing stat. 1 in 3 Black men born in 2001 can expect to be incarcerated at some point in his lifetime. This says nothing about the numerous instances in which if you were Black, Latino, your encounters with the police. I'll say something about that at the very end. And it doesn't matter whether you're a college professor, whether you're Barack Obama, whether you're Eric Holder, who's the former Attorney General, or you are a man or woman on the street. If you're living in certain kinds of contexts and given the racial bias, some of it explicit, some of it implicit, there's not a Black man whom I know in my life at every social economic strata who's not had some kind of encounter with the police, myself included. And that suggests that there's something that is going on. But 1 in 3 Black men born in 2001 can expect to be incarcerated at some point in his lifetime. Jail or prison is now viewed as a bedrock experience. Some would say a rite of passage for many Black males, poor males. And the place that they call home is jail or a prison cell, not his home address. And the other piece of this is going to jail in some instances, some communities, not all, but some, where going to jail represents a rational accommodation and adaptation to some of the devastating economic and social conditions that reside in those communities. And I'll say something about that shortly, okay? So those are the things I want you to sort of know. And then let me say something a little bit more about context in Philly and Chester and so forth. So here is just a spatial map of Chester and Philadelphia. You'll see Chester here. You'll see Swarthmore College here. And you will see the Philadelphia shaped file of the Philadelphia area. And you know, those who are from this area will know this is the Delaware River here. New Jersey's over here. And part of what you see if you look at this demographic here is that you'll see where there are higher concentrations of yellow and or green happens to be sections of the community that have those numbers of African Americans and or Latinos who are represented. So Chester happens to be a majority minority city. Majority African Americans, there's some Latinos living on the east end of the city, and you can see some of the parts of Philadelphia that have denser, higher concentrations of African Americans who live there. And notice Swarthmore College doesn't have too many minorities and or African Americans, a small slice. That's the historic Black section of Swarthmore that's right there. But this is just to show you that as I start taking you into context, it's important to really understand the communities that people are coming from. What's the socioeconomic background? What's the nature of the schools? All of us are blessed to have college education in front of us. You guys are going to be graduating in the spring. I'm a graduate of Swarthmore and the University of Michigan. That education cuts a path for us in ways that it doesn't quite for people who are living in these more disadvantaged communities. And then let me take you into some of this space. So here is a very interesting graph. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I want to just highlight a few things that shows the enormous concentration of people going off to state prison in Philadelphia and Chester over a period of time. And these data are from 2000. So remember I told you in that earlier graph, I have data from the administrative records from the Department of Corrections, those 46,000 records that I have. We took all of those records and we have zip code, we have race, we have ethnicity, we have gender, we have date of birth, we have the nature of someone's crime, whether it was drug crime, property crime, violent crime. We have the sentencing county, that is the county jail or prison that happens to have administered the sentence, but we also have the county where the person happened to have committed his or her crime. And I mostly have males in this database. And this just shows you the density of the prison concentration in very specific community contexts. And what I want you to pay particular attention to is the size of the circle. And I want you to pay attention to how dark the circle gets. I want you to pay particular attention to the brown and the red. So this is Chester City. It has a population of just under 37,000 people. In 2000, it had a lot of men, primarily men, going off to serve time in state prison, right? Look at Swarthmore, which is just 5 miles to the northeast. One person or no people going off to prison in that year. And then look at certain zip codes in Philadelphia. Look at that zip code, look at that zip code, and then look at the red zip codes. And if you were to take those zip codes and then look at the racial, ethnic population of those communities, look at the unemployment rate, look at the quality of the schools there, you would see a pretty strong correlation between disadvantage, socioeconomic disadvantage, and the number of individuals going off to prison. And this is just for 2000. Remember, I told you I have data from 1990 through 2000. This is just a little slice of data. And importantly, the growth in imprisonment has been concentrated among poor minority males who live in impoverished neighborhoods, and importantly, those who've dropped out of high school and or who are out of work, right? How many of you guys are familiar with the HBO acclaimed series, The Wire, right? The best television show ever, and I want somebody to argue with me, the best television show ever. The Wire shows this in enormous graphic terms, 5 seasons. And what you get is this really kind of interesting, of course, you know, it's set in Baltimore, but this really interesting mix of what happens when a community space like Baltimore or Chester or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or some of the other northern industrial cities, these were economic, as some of your professors know, these were economic powerhouses in the 1950s, 1960s, in which jobs were plentiful. Didn't matter whether you were Black, white, Latino, Asian. If you wanted to work and wanted to work hard, you could really eke out a middle-class living. And what happens when those jobs disappear and there's nothing left to replace them? And the men in these communities oftentimes, unfortunately, go to illicit activities. The Wire shows this brilliantly. And part of what you see in this graph, in a mapping space, part of what I see in the human form when I go into the prison every week are men, and I work mostly with the men, who are coming from these neighborhoods who don't have work, who've dropped out of school, who can't find work, and the illicit drug trade is the only thing that they have going to try to eke out a living and or to try to provide for the families. And because, as the Wire shows, the illicit drug trade is open, right? It will draw the attention of police. It will draw the attention of law enforcement. And as many of my guys will say, they are low-hanging fruit. The wonderful other thing, wonderful or not, I want to underscore is that when we ask Americans, how many of you will admit to having committed a crime of some sort? You know, 70% of Americans admit to having committed some crime, right? I was driving just a few days ago, going to the grocery store. I was supposed to come to a complete stop. It really wasn't a complete stop. It was a rolling stop, right? And I ran through the red light. That's a minor offense, right? We do that all the time. Some crimes are more serious than others, but 70% of us readily admit to having committed a crime, and yet, as I showed you, there are more Black and brown people who end up in prison than their numbers might suggest. Overrepresentation, if you will. There's something that's going on in this community context space that is landing individuals or putting them in a path where the prison jail sentence, unfortunately, is something that is in their trajectory. Let me just show you one more piece of data, and then I want to make a couple conclusions and then give you some policy ideas, and then have us start an argument as well. So most of you are familiar with the war on drugs, right? You know that phrase. If you've read Michelle Alexander's text, The New Jim Crow, she specifically talks a lot about the war on drugs, and she argues, and there's some disagreement with her work, she argues that the enormous number of individuals going off to prison, particularly in the 1990s, 2000, late 80s, 1990s, 2000, is a result of the war on drugs. And we've been able to map, one of the few spaces, we've been able to map what happens when you see a war on drugs in a community space. So remember, I have data from 1990, I have data in 1995, 2000 and 2005, and we're able to distinguish them in terms of folks who are going off for drug-related crime and or other meaning property crime or a non-drug related crime. And what we've done is we've mapped this over those 4-year periods. So just look at Chester real quickly. The first bar there you see is 1990. The second bar you see is 1995. The next bar you see there is 2000. And the next bar you see there is 2005. And this is for everybody coming from the Chester community who's been sentenced to a prison sentence of 2 years or more. And all you have to do is look at the rising level of the green bar. And you see that over this 20-year period, there are more people coming from this community space who were sent off to state prison for a drug-related crime. So there's some evidence to suggest that Michelle Alexander is right. And then you just go and look at other zip codes here where you see enormous, huge people going off to prison, state prison for drug-related crime. And then you see other zip codes rather, where there's more likely going off for property-related crimes and all. But we've been able to sort of map this in a way, and it turns out that Michelle Alexander is not quite right. There's some real interesting nuances, complexities, context issues that explain why people are going off to prison, particularly over this 20-year period. So all of that, I want to leave you with this bottom line, and then I'll map out a couple policy ideas, and then we can get into an argument. Mass incarceration has grown to the point that it now produces the very social problems, high crime rates, unemployment, poverty, on which it feeds. And all you have to do is talk to somebody who's been in prison, particularly who's never been in prison before, right? You oftentimes hear he or she comes out a better prisoner. Why? Because they're learning how to do their craft while they've been incarcerated around individuals who have done this. And then very importantly, Black men, their families, neighborhoods are consigned to a more geographically concentrated and persistent kind of poverty and social disadvantage that dwarfs anything that previous generations of poor Blacks have ever experienced. This is why we are seeing, I would argue, so many of the kind of intractable problems around poverty. And all you have to do is look at those communities where there have been racial tensions in the last couple of years. Baltimore, Minneapolis, Kenosha, Washington, others. There is a high correlation between all of these problems and the police surveillance and the overpresence of law enforcement and the fact that so many folks feel preyed upon by law enforcement that forces people to say, we've had enough and we're not taking this any longer. So we're trying to get our handle on some of these issues. And then let me say something about some policy suggestions. And so one of the things that I would argue we need to do is invest in high quality early childhood education. You oftentimes will hear that that prison officials have already planned prison beds 15 years hence. And one of the arguments we make is if you can really give these communities high quality impact early childhood education interventions, and so much so that when kids get to a grade school level, they're reading at grade level, if not beyond. It helps keep them in school, it helps keep them engaged so that they're not being suspended. The worst thing you can do is send a kid to do an out-of-school suspension, because he or she is on the streets, they're idle. And those of you who have older parents and grandparents, there's a phrase that says, idleness is the devil's plaything, right? So if I am idle, I have nothing else to do. Some of my friends like, Doc, let's go and hang out. I have no idea what they're into or not. Sometimes I find myself at the wrong place, the wrong time, engaged in the wrong activity, and now I'm caught up and swept up in something I had no idea about. And so really high impact early education ends up being important. And then aggressively addressing the high school dropout crisis that's really persistent in urban and I would say rural communities. There are lots of our young men, some of our young women as well, but lots of our young men who drop out of high school because they are disengaged and or they've had a teacher who says, you're not going to amount to anything. And importantly, as The Wire shows us, the gravitational pull of the streets is a really, really strong force that's hard for some of the men I've worked with to say no to. And we have to address that. And then, of course, not surprisingly, reduce prison admissions, reduce the length of stay. One of the things we know is that people were being sentenced in prison much longer for longer stays than they would have 30, 40 years ago. And then there's something that's called ban the box. So when I come out of prison, I've done my time, I've paid my debts to society. Last time I've heard, the United States is supposed to be a community of second chances. And I go to fill out a job application. I even go out to fill out the Common App. I want to go to Cabrini University. And oftentimes there is a question that says, have you served a jail or prison sentence and or have you been convicted of a crime? Now I'm at a catch-22, right? Do I tell the truth and have this thwart my prospects? I've taken this Inside Out class and the professor says I can do college level work. And so do I tell the truth or not? Or I go to apply for an apartment or go to fill out the job application. This ban the box idea is meant to eliminate that question from the front of the application and put it at the very end so that I have a chance to sell myself, to talk about how an asset I would be great in the classroom and so on and so on. And then at the very end, I'm asked the same questions. I am hopefully giving an honest answer. And then the recruiters, the admission folks have a chance to do a little bit more probing, but the first question doesn't automatically thwart my chances coming out of the gate. And so that's the idea behind ban the box. And then the other policy idea that we're thinking through is creating some meaningful work opportunities so that a lot of these inner city communities, I also work with white men coming from poor rural communities, so I would add the rural communities here too, is creating some reliable job engines. Maybe it's around solar energy, maybe it's around green and clean energy, the new Green Deal, but we have to do something to make sure that there's a meaningful opportunity for work so that the drug trade and or criminal activity is less of an appeal, less of a draw, and that folks have a chance to really put their lives back into some meaningful fashion so they can take care of themselves and take care of their families. And then lastly, let me just end it with one important, more personal piece. So I told you I grew up in Chester, this community space where this prison is now located. It wasn't there when I was growing up as a kid. And it turns out, I sort of knew this when I was growing up, but it turns out most of the men whom I work with don't know that a young Martin Luther King Jr. was a student who lived in the Chester community for 3 years. And the prison where I worked, so the prison that I showed you back in this slide, that prison, right, is just 1.5 miles from where this marker is. This is the historic Calvary Baptist Church, where a young 19-year-old Martin Luther King, so he was Martin Luther King before he became Martin Luther King, but a young 19-year-old seminary and college student who was doing his seminary degree at Chester, in Chester, he lived in this community space for 3 years. And the men whom I work with at the prison don't know that King lived in the community. He was preaching in churches. He was playing pool at the pool hall across, around the corner from this church. he was in neighbors' houses, eating dinner and so forth. He could be seen on the Crozier campus studying with his classmates. And so part of what I say to my guys that I work with is, how is it that a community that helped to produce someone who became the Martin Luther King that we know, why and how did this community get to a point where it's sending all of you, most of you, to this facility here? And the one thing I didn't mention, and I'll close with this, is on any given day, there are 1,200 men, 1,200, 1,200 men who are doing time in this particular facility. That for me is just, I'm still trying to reckon with that. How is a space that produces a young Martin Luther King Jr. who becomes the Martin Luther King, right? I have a dream, and so on and so on. It's sending so many of its young black and brown and white men, poor white men, to this space. So that's what I've been up to and trying to, as John Lewis would say, cause some good trouble. And so let's take your questions and your points of disagreement. And so the floor is yours.
If anyone has a question, do you want to just raise your hand? We can see you.
Yes.
And turn on your cameras, all you
Uh-huh.
names at the bottom.
And I see something in the chat room. Okay, gotcha. Gotcha. All right. So anything I said that you disagree with, fundamentally, conceptually, this is not all about agreeing with Reeves, right?
Some of you I know have good questions because I read them.
You can ask me anything, large or small. I'll do my best to give you an honest and transparent answer. And I'm the first to say I don't know. Let me think about that and get back to you. But the floor is yours to ask and or probe a bit further about anything.
I'll ask the first question since no one's raised their hand. It occurred to me while you were talking, we've heard an awful lot about the gun violence that's happening in Philadelphia and the area lately. It's just terrifying. So what do you think would be the impact of gun control legislation or changes in gun ownership on the incarceration of people from the city?
That's a great question. The honest answer is I don't know. And here's why, and that is so much of the gun violence, my own personal experience, and having been in this space now for 17 years and being really, really disturbed with the gun violence, is certainly the proliferation and the availability of guns is a huge, huge problem. And I think there have to be real serious attempts to not simply advance gun control legislation, but also to do gun back programs. If you've got more than you should have, and or if you've got something that's illegal that hasn't been registered, we're going to have these programs where you just give us the gun, no questions asked. We might give you a $100 gift certificate or something, but we've got to put those incentives in place. But we also have to make the community safer. So a lot of my guys, in fact, I have a young male who's coming out of prison shortly. I just got an email from his family yesterday. He ended up, unfortunately, was 15 when he went in. He was a juvenile. And he ended up shooting a gentleman in broad daylight, which is nonsensical to me. But the gentleman whom he shot in broad daylight was someone who he was working for, selling drugs for, and that's contested. But the guy whom I've been working with for the last year and a half, 2 years or so, who I taught in my prison course, ended up doing, getting a juvenile life sentence for killing this guy. And it was a drug disagreement gone bad. My guy says that the guy threatened to kill him and so forth. And it's Brian Stevenson, who, if you don't know that name, I will give you one assignment. to find out who Brian Stevenson is. He wrote an enormously moving memoir called Just Mercy. And Brian Stevenson went to the Supreme Court and argued, Justice Ginsburg was 7-1, argued that you can't give a juvenile a life sentence because you have to allow for juvenile development. You have to allow for an opportunity for that individual to have a second or third chance to change his life. And my guy happened to benefited from that ruling. But one of the things that he will say is the community isn't safe. So these guys carry guns, they carry knives with them, in part to protect themselves. There's enormous distrust among law enforcement. And it's a cyclical cycle. So I'm not endorsing, I want to be clear, I'm not condoning endorsing gun violence. I'm saying that there's an explanation for the proliferation of guns. There are far too many of them in the community space. And we have to do it at both ends. That is incentives, but also put in place a meaningful gun control legislation. But we also have to make the community safer. So that anybody, male or female, young or old, walking in the community doesn't feel like he or she has to have a gun or a knife on them to feel as if they can protect themselves. We know from the research, if I have a weapon on me and someone comes on me and I feel threatened, I'm more likely to use it. That's part of the problem. So we've got to do something about the community spaces, even as we deal with gun control, sensible gun control legislation. I saw, I think I saw Brian's hand. Yes, no? Yeah,
My question was gonna be if it would be like a good solution to help police officers have more time in service of like doing community service, like have police officers have community service hours so that they can have a connection with their communities. And
yeah,
if that would help.
I think that's exactly right. That's brilliant. And there's some communities that are starting to do that. We need more of that. But here's the catch-22, right? So if I am enormously distrustful of the police, and I also know that I'm living in parts of Chester or Philadelphia that are over-policed, over-surveilled, and I can commit a crime. So let me go back to this map real quickly. Let me share my screen real quickly. I can be right on the Philadelphia border here. I can be right on the Philadelphia border here, commit a crime in Montgomery County or Delaware County, Chester County, commit the same crime in Philadelphia. I will get treated very differently. But also if I'm white, if I'm wealthier, I have resources to make it that my name doesn't appear in the paper, and I might get bail. I have guys who I've worked with who's sitting in the county prison who can't make $500 bail, right? For wealthy people, $500 is nothing. They spend that in the space of 5 minutes. But for somebody who is coming from a disadvantaged urban community, $500 is an enormous amount of money. And I have guys who I've worked with who cannot make $500 bail. Misdemeanor charge, drug marijuana possession. They can't make $500 bail. They don't have the money for a private attorney. And so they are sitting languishing there for months, pre-trial, with nothing to do. And then they eventually get released. Now they are really angry. They're dispirited. They're isolated. So we've got to do something about the community space that makes it okay for me to even have a relationship with a police officer, to talk to a police officer. In these communities, some of you may or may not know, there is a huge snitching culture, anti-snitching culture. And you come under some real serious issues if you are perceived and or seen as even cooperating with the police, right? That's a huge problem. And I don't know a way that you get at that other than, as Brian has suggested, having communities who are willing to embrace police officers and policing and community policing, and having police officers who are willing to say, I live in the community space and I'm willing to be a part of the community, and I will not ride around in the SWAT car all day, but I'm going to get on my bike or I'm going to get on foot, and I'm just going to patrol and walk through the community and get the kids to know who I am. One of the things that's been enormously problematic is the stop and frisk policy, which most of you will know that was implemented in New York, declared unconstitutional. But there are stop and frisk policies all around urban spaces. I know I live in Swarthmore, which is a pretty wealthy community. I am out at all hours of the night and day, 6 in the morning doing my run, 11 o'clock at night. And I can count on both hands and most of your hands the number of times, even in Swarthmore, I've lived here for 20 years, that I've had a police car follow me because I'm a black male in a space, quote unquote, I'm not supposed to be. So when that happens and those interactions happen, it ends up being really, really problematic to trust police. And even because of my work, I deal with police officers, attorneys, judges all the time. I have a huge apprehensiveness around police. If you have an African-American friend or neighbor or classmate, ask him or her, if they're willing to share, about what we call the talk. And that is a conversation that a black parent or mother or father will have with his or her black son, children, daughter, about how to interface when you are come upon by the police. It is the most disturbing, problematic conversation that any parent will ever have, but you have to have that conversation because you want your kid to come home at the end of the day. And there isn't a parent whom I know, black parent, Latino parent whom I know, of every economic strata who has not had the talk with his or her kid. That has to change, but it takes one-on-one interaction. So Brian's absolutely right. We need more community policing. The defund, I hate that word, defund policing movement is an attempt to try to get more community policing and police officers to really not simply live in the communities that they are policing, but also really get to know those members, their youth, their young people. And this is going to be problematic for some people. We need more women and minority police officers. We need more women, minority prosecutors. We need more minority and women judges and law enforcement officers because they are a greater representation of the society. Imagine if you were one of my guys who's African-American or Latino, or even poor white, and you walk into a courtroom, it's already an intimidating experience. And there's no one in the courtroom, judge, bailiff, court officer, prosecutor, who looks like you, or who even can understand. I grew up, not in the best schools, and my mom was unemployed or whatever, but I ended up getting into the situation where I had some drugs on me. The prosecutors make enormous power and decisions about life and death. And there's no one in the courtroom who looks like me. And then I go off and do my jail time, my sentence, and now I come out, and what are my prospects? We have to spend some time really pouring resources into these community spaces to make them healthier, better, stronger, safer. Let's get a couple other questions. I saw John, and then let's get one of the young women in. So John, you'll go first, and then I'll get one of the young ladies in, please.
Sure. I'm going to just actually follow up on that last, on what you were just talking about in terms of, as you can see, I'm like you, I'm an African-American male. And one of the things I've done in my life is question, how do we get more of us in these spaces? So especially when we're talking about policing, I've talked to some recently, some police chiefs, and they had the question for me, like, where do we go? How do we, where do we go to find more people of color? Where do we find to go more minorities while still maintaining, our level of X, Y, and Z? Because, here you have to go to, community college and get the degree for the policing. And if there's not enough in that space, where then do you go? Do you go to Lincoln University? Do you go to Cheney? What are your thoughts on where do we find, or how do we start recruiting, especially for police and the
It's a great question, John. Thank you for that. I would argue, and I'm being mindful of time here, so let me answer John's question quickly and then get one question from one of the young women, and then we'll close out. So John, you're absolutely right. My view would be get the best education you can. Community college, Cabrini, it's a great school, and be the best person you can be, and then begin to network. The opportunities will come to you. I am in court spaces all the time, and in some instances, unless I bring some of my students, I'm the only Black person in the courtroom. That cannot and should not happen in 2019, 2020. It can't. It shouldn't happen. We're starting to see some greater representation from women, but we need people who can. This is the wonderful thing about Justice Ginsburg, right? She suffered an enormous amount of sexual gender discrimination over her entire life. How are you number one in your law school class? You were number one at Harvard Law School class. And she says she had 3 strikes against her. She was Jewish, she was a woman, and she was the mother of a 4-year-old, I believe. And she couldn't find a job. Are you kidding me? She could not find a job. And so she ended up being a college professor, started out at Rutgers, and started attacking the gender discrimination case. So sometimes you grow where God plants you. And my view is grow where you're planted. So get the best education you can, begin to network, ask around and say, I happen to be interested in X, Y, Z. If you shoot me an email, any one of you, wanting to network with someone, I can say, okay, I'll connect you guys. You're connected with the Cabrini class that I did on Tuesday, and I won't even give you and charge you a finder's fee. But it's my job to network you. We need more of you. We need your generation to step up and really come into all of these spaces and bring your ethical, emotional, intellectual intelligence to make these spaces more the representation of the kinds of communities and world that we want to live in. Trust me, if we don't, we are paying for it. We spent $180 billion with a B, 180 B, dollars on corrections, policing, judges in this country a year. $180 billion. We spend 1.2, 1.5 billion in the state of Pennsylvania. Think about where all that money could be going, particularly in the midst of a pandemic, right? And I don't know if you've driven around Delaware County. There are potholes everywhere, right? There are potholes everywhere. Think about where all that money is going. We're spending it in the wrong places, I would argue. So let me just get one question from one of the young women, and then I unfortunately will have to close out. I'm mindful of your time, and we are already at 4:34 according to my watch. So one question from one of the young women, and then we'll close out.
I'm going to post in chat a question that was written by one of the young women.
Terrific. How can the average citizen get involved and advocate for racial justice? What government officials do you recommend contacting, making legislative changes? Awesome, awesome, awesome. So I would first suggest, and maybe I can arrange this with your profs. I sit on the board of Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site. It's the original prison in this country. So if you are in this work long enough, you will know, most of you might, Al Capone. This is where Al Capone was sentenced to prison for a bit of time. And it's an enormous, enormous facility that actually in some instances explains why we have the penal criminal justice system we have in this country. And so I'll talk to your 2 profs to see if we can get you guys at my cost. It won't cost you guys anything. For as many of you who want to do a virtual tour at Eastern State, just to get an intro. And it's not mandatory, but any of you, as many of you want, we will arrange that, and I will take care of that on my end. And that's a nice introduction to just getting your feet wet. And then in this era of racial reckoning, those of you in your communities, Delaware County, each one of you is in a county that has its own jail. And that's a good place to start. And then reaching out to your legislative person and say, I am a student at Cabrini College. and I'm interested in interning. They will jump at the chance to grab you. They need your ideas. They want your ideas. I got pulled into a series of policy conversations with one of my neighbors who happens to be the state senator here. And for me, that's been extraordinary learning experience to not simply bring my expertise, but more importantly, to learn and to be part of the problem, right? So as much as I am in prison spaces, I have a huge, very critical piece to say about corrections and criminal legal processes and so on. But I also recognize that aside from teaching, if I can be a part of a conversation that leads to better law enforcement, that leads to more sensitive prosecutions, that leads to perhaps the elimination of cash bail, right? All of those things are things that we can do at an individual level. And then, of course, I will say this, I won't tell you who to vote for. That's your choice. It's not for me to say, but I will tell you it's really, really incumbent for your generation to step up and participate and vote. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't get, and your two profs will tell you, they get it as well. There isn't a day or week that goes by we don't get some email from some organization saying, I need research assistants, I need interns. Some of them are paid. So those are ways that you can get involved. And the other piece of this, and you guys are powerful because you are mass communication scholars. And so much of what we know, so much of the implicit racial and explicit racial biases come from the media that we consume, and those cultural images and the ways in which politicians play on that, right? And you have a huge role and responsibility to educate us and to compel us to be different and to present different images. Remember, I said to you, 70% of Americans readily admit to having committed a crime. I just said to you, I committed a minor infraction just a few days ago, right? So how is it and why is it that our vision of who is criminal, the criminal us, our vision of who is criminal, and when you ask somebody who's criminal, oftentimes immediately you think of someone who's black, brown. And that is coming from something that is deeper than just, and most of us have never been victims of crimes. That's the other interesting piece. So you guys are sitting at an enormous opportunity. Justice Ginsburg has said, pursue justice. Pursue justice. That's her calling. That's her mantra to us. And each one of us, I think, whether you agree with her views or not, she is essentially saying to us, in your generation in particular, you have an enormous, enormous opportunity to get involved. And there isn't a community space around you that would not welcome your invitation. And as John Lewis would say, you're getting into sort of good, necessary trouble.
That's a really good way to end.
And so before I leave you, let me just give you my email address so that you can follow up with me. Please shoot questions, things that come to you. I may have said something that you disagree with, that you were shy about sharing. Shoot me an email. I promise I'll get back to you. So my email is K as in kite, lowercase k, REE, V as in Victor, ES, the number 1, at SWARTHMORE.edu. So K Reeves 1 at swarthmore.edu. And let me just put it in the chat window.
I did.
Okay, gotcha. Gotcha. See, I tell you, Kathy's always on it. This has been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. Thanks so much, guys. Please keep in touch. And if there's anything, and I do mean this in all sincerity, I am on sabbatical leave this year. And so I get a chance to finally work on my stuff and work on the things that I care about. Professor Youngman has been awesome. And if there's anything that I can do and be helpful, particularly as you guys work through your capstone projects and/or if there are opportunities that you want to connect with some of the folks who are in my network, I'm happy to share that information with you. And I will just make the introduction and I'll get out the way. And as I said, I won't charge a finder's fee unless it ends up being pretty lucrative. Then I'll ask for like 2% or 5%. All right.
Well, thank you very much,
awesome.
Dr. Reeves.
Thank you. Awesome.
I say.
Thank you. And stay healthy. Have a great semester. And do reach out. I know some of you have already sent a couple of things, so I promise to follow up. But do reach out, and if there are ways in which I can be helpful, I'm here. Great. Thanks for the invitation.